Hey guys, tonight we are going to do something the most famous frontier story in America never let you do. We are going to look directly at the one person Laura Ingalls Wilder decided you were never supposed to see clearly. You have met her before if you grew up on the Little House books, or if you only ever watched the show on a Sunday evening as a child. She has already crossed your path once, near the end of one of the most beloved chapters in the whole series. A pretty woman in a neat brown dress and a sunbonnet, driving a buggy alone across half a country, arriving out of nowhere with the news that changes everything. She is the reason the Ingalls family finally goes to Dakota. She is the reason there is a Silver Lake, and a town called De Smet, and a long winter, and one last little house on one last claim. Pull her out of the story and the entire second half of it simply does not happen. Her name is Docia, Aunt Docia Pa's younger sister, Laura's aunt. And tonight, the gentle, pretty, slightly glamorous woman you remember from the page is going to step aside. Just for a few hours, so that the real one can come forward out of the dark. Because before Aunt Docia ever drove west to change her brother's life, she had already lived through something the Little House books do not contain. Not a hardship, not a bad winter or a failed crop, the ordinary disasters every frontier family knew. Something rarer and stranger and far more terrible. Her first husband, the father of the cousins Laura would later play with on the Dakota Prairie, was not the kindly widower the books quietly imply. He was a young man who, one night, in the dark, fired through the door of a logging camp, where he was working as paymaster, killing a man named Milo Goodenough, and was sent to Waupun State Prison for 8 years. And Docia, with one small child and another already on the way, found herself inside one of the rarest and most socially costly positions a frontier woman could face. Her marriage to August ended in divorce. Laura almost certainly knew the family story, because this was not a distant scandal. It belonged to her own aunt, her own cousins, and the family circle she later turned into literature. She knew it the way you know the difficult things about your own blood, the things the grown-ups discuss in low voices over a kitchen table, while the children pretend not to listen and absorb every word. And when she sat down, decades later, to turn her family into a story that millions of children would read at bedtime, the published books made a quiet, powerful omission. August disappeared. The prison sentence disappeared. The divorce disappeared. She turned a divorced woman into a wife. She turned a convict's abandoned children into the stepchildren of a kindly railroad man. She kept the buggy, the brown dress, the generous offer of $50 a month, and she folded the killing and the prison and the divorce down so small and so flat that they vanished from the page completely, as if they had never happened at all. So, before we begin, let me ask you the questions that are going to pull us through this whole long night together. What makes a young paymaster fire through a logging camp door in the dark? What happens to a marriage when a husband is convicted, sent to Waupun, and removed from his family for 8 years? And what does it cost a woman, in that world, when the law ends her marriage and leaves her to carry the shame, the children, and the silence? How does a person rebuild a life out of that kind of wreckage, and not only survive it, but rise out of it, and end up, of all things, the one who saves her famous brother's family? And the question underneath all of the others, the one this whole story is really about: why would Laura, who loved her, take such enormous care to make sure you would never know? Now, before we go any further, do what you came here to do. Settle in. Dim the lights down low. Turn the fan on if you like that soft wall of sound. Pull the blanket up to your chin and let the day you just had drift off behind you. And while you are settling in, one small thing. If these slow, true stories are the kind that help you drift off, go ahead and tap the like button and subscribe if you have not already, so the next one finds its way to you on some other long night like this one. And if you feel like it, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. whether this is reaching you in your own warm bed, or a chair beside a window, or somewhere far from home. I do read them, and there is something quietly companionable in knowing who else is out there in the dark with me. All right, now, we are going a long way back tonight, more than a century and a half, into a country of deep timber and deep snow and a single candle burning in a cabin window. And we are going to walk all the way through one woman's hidden life, slowly, gently, from the firelit dance where a child first remembered her through the worst night of her life, and out the other side of it, all the way to the muddy morning she pulled her buggy into a yard in Minnesota, and set the rest of the most famous frontier story in America quietly into motion. This is the story of Aunt Docia, the one the books were never quite willing to tell you. Close your eyes and let us begin. Here is the shape of the journey ahead, so you can rest inside it and let it carry you, chapter by chapter, into sleep. Chapter 1 takes you into the Ingalls family itself, the 10 children, the long road west, the crowded, firelit world a girl was born into in 1845, and shows you exactly where Docia fit among her brothers and sisters. Chapter 2 follows her into her first marriage, to a young man named August Waldvogel, and into the small, bright, hopeful life they built with their own hands in the Wisconsin timber. Chapter 3 is the night it all broke, the gun, the dark, the dead man, the trial, and the 8-year sentence that ended Docia's first marriage in the worst way a marriage can end. Chapter 4 is the divorce and what it truly meant to be a divorced frontier mother in that time and how she carried it. Chapter 5 is her second chance, her marriage to Hiram Forbes, the man the books would later turn into the only husband she was ever shown to have. Chapter 6 is the visit, the buggy, the offer, the moment Docia reached into her brother's life and pulled the whole Ingalls family north, into Dakota, into Silver Lake, into De Smet, and straight into the path of the long winter. And Chapter 7 is the erasure itself, what Laura did with all of this when she finally wrote it down, and why she did it, and what we lose and what we quietly recover when we set the books gently aside and look at the woman the records actually describe. It is a long way to travel. Let us begin where she began, in a crowded house full of children, in a country that was still half forest. Picture yourself born into a family of 10 children. Not 10 the way we might say it now, a large number on a page. 10 the way it was actually lived, which is something a modern person can barely hold in the mind. 10 children moving through a cabin like a single restless animal with many heads. 10 sets of clothes to mend and feed and keep from the cold. 10 in a household that was less like a family in our sense, and more like a small, mobile, self-governing settlement that happened to share a single name and a single hearth. That was the world Docia was born into the middle of, and the middle is exactly where she sat, which matters more than almost anything else about her early life. Her father was Lansford Whiting Ingalls. Her mother was Laura Louise Colby Ingalls, who happened to share her first name with the most famous granddaughter the family would ever produce. Together they had 10 children across more than 20 years, though one would not live past infancy, leaving 9 to grow up, and you should sit with that span for just a moment, because it tells you something the names alone cannot. 20-some years of childbearing, a mother whose entire adult life, from her early 20s deep into her 40s, was one unbroken sequence of carrying, and birthing, and nursing, and burying, and beginning again. The oldest child, Peter, arrived in 1833. The youngest, a daughter named Ruby, arrived in 1855, 22 years later. In between came the others, and one of them, born sometime in 1845, as the family was drifting through the country between Illinois and the Wisconsin woods, was a girl they named Laura LaDocia, Docia for short. The exact place of her birth is one of those small things the records themselves cannot quite agree on, and that disagreement is its own kind of evidence. A family settled and secure leaves clean, consistent records. A family always on the move, drifting west, along the Great Migration Corridor, that carried hundreds of thousands of old stock Yankee Protestant families out of the worn-out soil of New England and upstate New York and into the open country beyond the Great Lakes, leaves records that blur and contradict because the famine itself was a moving target. What the record does agree on is the year 1845, and the fact that by the time Docia was a small child, the Ingalls family had come to rest, at least for a while, in the timber country of Wisconsin, where her father bought 80 acres in the 1850s, and the family settled into the deep woods. That one of those children would one day make immortal under a different name. The Big Woods. Let me put her among her brothers and sisters for a moment, because these are the people who filled her childhood, and several of them carry their own quiet threads through the largest story you already know. The eldest was Peter, who would grow up and marry a young woman from a neighbouring family, a marriage that helped tie the Ingalls clan and that other family together so tightly, through more than one wedding, that the children of the next generation were bound by blood far more closely than ordinary cousins. Then came Charles, born in 1836, the brother who would one day become Pa, the gentle, restless father at the heart of the most beloved frontier story ever written. After Charles came Lydia, and then a sister named Polly, and then a boy named James, and then Docia in the middle, and below her, the younger ones, Hiram and George, and at the very bottom, little Ruby, the baby, born when Docia was already 10 years old and helping to raise her. Feel her position in all of that. She was not the responsible eldest, the one the whole household leaned on. She was not the petted, protected youngest, the one everyone fussed over. She was a middle child in an enormous family, which is its own particular fate, the fate of learning early to be useful, to fold yourself into the endless work of the household, to expect little, and to ask for less. Now picture the actual texture of her days, because it is nothing like a child's life now. And the difference is the whole point. From the time a girl in that world could walk, she was given work. And as she grew, the work grew with her, until by the time she was Docia's age, she could very likely do nearly everything her mother could do. Cook over an open fire, bake the bread, churn the butter, salt and smoke, and preserve the meat that had to last all winter, spin the wool and the flax, sew and mend and patch, make the soap and dip the candles, tend the garden, mind the smaller children, sit up through the night with the sick, hold a whole household together through the long buried months, when the snow shut the family in, and the world narrowed down to 4 log walls and a circle of firelight inside them. None of this was considered hardship. It was simply what a woman's life was, and a girl who could do all of it well was, in the plain language of the time, a girl who would make a good wife, which was very nearly the only future the frontier could imagine for her. And around all that work turned the seasons, which were not the gentle calendar decorations they have become for us, but the hard governing rhythm of staying alive. Spring, when the sap rose and the ground softened and the whole year's hope went into the planting. Summer, the long-held breath of growing and tending and waiting to see whether the crop would come. Autumn, the frantic harvest, the desperate work of putting up enough food and enough fuel, because what you had stored by the first hard frost was, very simply, what you would have to live on until the spring and then winter. The long Wisconsin winter that came early and left late, and buried the timber country under snow, and shut the family into the cabin for months on end, where the firelit room became the entire world, and a family learned, season after season, exactly how much they needed one another. And underneath all of it ran the simple, constant fact of motion, because the Ingalls family, like so many of their kind, was always, in some senses, on its way somewhere. To understand Docia, you have to feel that, the way a child raised on a moving ship feels the sea without ever naming it. She was born into a family that had already crossed much of a continent in pieces, generation by generation, push by push, out of the thin and stony farms of New England, west into New York and then west again, drawn by the oldest American promise there was, the belief that the good land, the land that would finally pay off a lifetime of labour, was always a little further on. Her grandparents' generation had made part of that journey. Her parents made more of it, and she was carried along inside it, an infant in a wagon or a small child on a hard road, through a country that was still, in great stretches, more forest and prairie than farm and town. Try to feel what a journey like that actually was, because it is nothing like the way we move now. There were no maps worth the name for much of it. There were roads that became rivers of mud every spring and tracks of frozen ruts every winter, and clouds of choking dust every dry summer. A family loaded what it owned into a wagon, which was not much, because a wagon holds only so much, and the rest, the furniture, the heavier tools, the things that did not fit, was sold or given away or simply left behind in the dooryard of the place they were leaving, the way you leave a part of your life behind every time you start over. And then they went, at the pace of an ox or a tired horse, a few miles a day, sleeping under the wagon or under the open sky, fording streams, mending wheels, watching the weather the way a sailor watches it, because the weather could kill you, and burying, sometimes, along the way, the ones who did not survive the trip, in graves beside a road they would never pass again. That was the rhythm of the world Docia was born into. Arrival was always temporary, home was always provisional, and the family's deepest strength, the thing that held it together through all the moving, was simply itself the unbreakable obligation of the people who shared the wagon and the name. When they finally came to rest in the Wisconsin timber, in the deep woods that one of those children would make immortal, it must have felt, for a while, like an ending. 80 acres, a cabin in the trees, a place to stop. But it was the kind of stopping that frontier families did between movements, a held breath, and the children growing up inside it, absorbed, without ever being told. The lesson that the ground beneath your feet was never quite permanent, and that the only thing you could truly count on was the people around the fire. Docia learned that lesson young. She would have terrible cause to lean on it before she was 30. It was in the bright break of one of those springs that the single surviving image of the young Docia was made, the sugaring off. When the maple sap ran and a family boiled it down to sugar and gathered everyone it could for the one great social celebration that cracked the long isolation of winter wide open with food and fire and music and dancing, picture it the way a small child would have seen it, because that is exactly how it has come down to us. The big house of the grandparents, warm and crowded and gloriously loud after the silence of the snow, the dense sweet smell of the syrup boiling down, the fiddle, because there was always a fiddle, and the older people clapping the time, and the young ones dancing, the unmarried daughters, and the newly married ones in their best dresses, caught for one bright firelit evening in that brief golden window of frontier youth, before marriage and children, and the hard arithmetic of survival closed over them for good, and one of those young women dancing in a dress with dark, round, gleaming buttons that the small watching girl thought looked exactly like blackberries. That girl was Laura. That dancing aunt was Docia, and that is the whole of what the books would ever keep of her early life. A dress, a dance, a few seconds of remembered prettiness in a warm, loud, firelit room. Here is the quiet engine of this entire story, and I want you to hold it gently as we go. The small girl who loved that dress, who fixed her pretty aunt forever in her memory dancing in the firelight, was Laura. And the old woman who would, more than 70 years later, decide exactly how much of Aunt Docia's life the world would ever be permitted to see, was also Laura. The same person, the child who adored the dress, and the writer with the pen, who knew by then everything that had happened to the woman wearing it, and who chose to hand her readers the dress, the dance, the prettiness, and almost nothing else. We will come back to that choice. It is the heart of the 7th chapter, and in a way it is the heart of the whole night. But first we have to earn it. We have to learn what Laura knew. So let the firelight fade now, and the music with it, and follow the pretty aunt out of that warm, bright room and into the life the dress was hiding. She was about to make the most important decision of her young life, and she was going to make it, like all of them, with almost no way on earth of knowing how it would turn out. Imagine you are 19 years old, in the deep timber of Wisconsin, and a young man has asked you to build a life with him. That is roughly where Docia stood sometime in the middle 1860s when she married a young man named August Waldvogel. And the first thing to understand about that marriage is how young they both were. The accounts that survive suggest August was around 18, very nearly still a boy, and Docia was only a little older. To us that sounds almost impossibly young to be founding a household. To them it was ordinary, even expected, because on the frontier marriage came early. The work demanded it. The years did not wait. A young couple did not court for a polite season and then save for a wedding the way couples often do now. They decided, in the slow, sure, unspoken way that frontier people decided the largest things, that they would belong to each other and build a life together, and then they began building it. At once, with their own 2 pairs of hands, out of almost nothing at all, and that is exactly what August and Docia did. They built a house, a small one, a cabin in the timber, the way every frontier home began, raised log by log out of the very forest that surrounded it, chinked against the cold, roofed against the snow, a single warm box of human life, set down in the middle of an immense and indifferent wilderness. And into that house, in 1866, came their first child, a daughter. They named her Lena. Now, the surviving records about August Waldvogel are thin, and the temptation, when you know a catastrophe is coming, is to rush past the quiet years on the way to it. But the small bright life was real. It deserves to be seen on its own terms, gently, before the dark thing arrives and swallows everything around it. So stay here with me a moment, in the first year of that cabin, before the gun, before the trial, before any of it. Feel the place. A young husband, barely a man, learning the enormous weight of being responsible for other lives. A young wife who had grown up in a house overflowing with brothers and sisters, and who now, for the first time in her life, had a household of her very own to keep. A new baby daughter, small and loud and impossibly alive, in a cradle by the fire, the green smell of new-cut wood and the blue smell of wood smoke. And all around the cabin, the particular silence of the deep timber, which is not really silence at all, but a vast, soft, layered thing, the wind moving high in the pines, the creak and sigh of the branches, the far-off call of birds, a silence a modern person dropped into it would find almost unbearable, and that these 2 young people simply lived inside the way we live inside the endless hum of a city without ever hearing it. They had what young frontier couples had, which is to say they had each other, and a roof, and the strength of their own bodies, and a great deal of hope, and almost no margin at all for anything to go wrong. There was no doctor close by. There was no money set aside for a hard season. There was no cushion of any kind between an ordinary life and a sudden disaster, and both of them knew it. In the bone-deep way, everyone in that world knew it, because every one of them had watched it happen to someone. A fever in the night, a wound that turned bad, a winter that came too hard and stayed too long. The frontier did not need a reason to take a life, and it took them constantly. And the people who lived there built their whole understanding of the world on the certain knowledge that catastrophe was not a possibility but an appointment, the only mystery being its timing and its shape. What none of them could have guessed was the shape this particular catastrophe would take, because the disaster coming for August and Docia Waldvogel was not a fever or a failed crop or a hard winter, none of the ordinary tools the frontier used to break a young family. It was something far rarer and far stranger and far more terrible, and it would come not from the blind, indifferent forces of nature, but from a single human decision, made in the dark, in a moment of fear, with a loaded gun in a young man's hands. And now I want to take you into the world that the next part of this story turns on, because the catastrophe that is coming does not make sense unless you understand the strange, rough, money-haunted world of the frontier logging camp and what it meant to be the man who held the cash inside it. Picture the pine woods of Wisconsin in the cold months, because winter was the season of the timber harvest, when the ground froze hard enough to haul the great logs out, and the swamps that were impassable in summer turned to solid roads of ice. Into those frozen woods went the camps. Crews of men, dozens of them, far from any town, living together in long, low bunkhouses, working from before dawn until after dark, in brutal, dangerous cold, felling timber that had stood for centuries. Cutting it, hauling it, stacking it on the frozen rivers to float downstream when the spring thaw came. It was some of the hardest physical labour the frontier offered, done by some of the hardest men it produced, men who came in for the season from everywhere and nowhere, drawn by wages that were good precisely because the work was so punishing and the conditions so severe. A camp like that was its own small, sealed society, with its own rough rules, far beyond the reach of any sheriff or court, and at the centre of it, holding it together, sat the man who handled the money. The paymaster, the keeper of the store. He was the one who recorded each man's time, who paid out the wages, who ran the camp store where the men bought their tobacco and their boots and their few comforts on credit against pay they had not yet earned. He was, in a single person, the bank, the payroll office, and the company shop for a crew of rough men in the middle of a frozen wilderness. And that meant he was the one place in the whole camp where the money actually was, in his cabin, in his strongbox, in the drawer beneath his hand. Now hold that image and ask yourself the question August Waldvogel must have asked himself every single night. Who knows the money is here? And the answer, in a camp like that, was everyone. Every man in the bunkhouse knew that the paymaster held the wages. Every drifter who passed through, every stranger who came out of the woods looking for work or for trouble could guess it, assess it. There was no vault, there was no guard, there was no law within a day's hard ride, and a day's hard ride in a Wisconsin winter, through snow and over frozen track, was the difference between calling for help and being entirely, absolutely alone. The man who held the money in a logging camp lived every night with the quiet, grinding awareness that he was the most obvious target for 100 miles, and that if someone came for it, in the dark, there would be no one to call and no one to come. That is the weight August Waldvogel carried into the dark each night, while his young wife and his small daughter slept behind him. And I want you to feel it, not to excuse what he eventually did, because a man was killed, and nothing undoes that, but to understand the pressure inside which he did it. He was very young. He was responsible, suddenly, not only for his own family, but for the wages of dozens of hard men. And he was living, every night, inside a fear that the world he lived in made entirely reasonable. And Docia, through these months, lived the other half of that life, the half the records say almost nothing about, the half I can only sketch for you from the shape of the world around her, because if August was at the camp, then Docia was often, for long stretches, the woman keeping the home alone. A young wife with a baby, in a cabin in the timber, through the long dark of the cutting season, while her husband was away at the camp doing the dangerous work that paid for it all. She would have known his fear, because a wife knows. She would have understood, better than anyone, exactly what it meant that her young husband sat each night between a strong box full of other men's wages and a door that anyone could come through. The fear was not only his, it would have lived in her too. Every night he was away, the low hum of dread, that is the constant companion of the people who love someone in a dangerous trade. This was the texture of the small bright life once you look closely at it. Not a single unbroken idyll, but the ordinary frontier mixture of love and hope, and grinding, ceaseless anxiety. A young couple, married for love and for the future, building something real, and beneath it, always, the knowledge that the world they had chosen could take it all away in a night. They had chosen it anyway, everyone did. There was no version of that life without the risk, and so you accepted the risk, and you built your home, and you raised your child, and you tried, most nights, not to think about the dark beyond the door. And then came the night when the dark beyond the door was no longer empty. Here is what we know about how it began. And I am going to be careful with my words, because the surviving account is brief, and a brief account leaves room for things we cannot actually confirm, and an honest telling has to respect that. At some point after Lena was born, August Waldvogel took on a new kind of work. He became the man responsible for the money, a paymaster for a logging crew, the keeper of the cash, and the wages for a gang of timber workers cutting in the Wisconsin woods. You have to understand what a logging camp was to understand why that detail matters so much. The timber industry was one of the engines of the frontier economy, and a logging camp was a rough, remote, masculine world, a cluster of men far from any town, far from any law, doing brutally hard and dangerous work in the cold. And in that world, the man who held the money was the man everyone knew held the money. He was the bank, the payroll, and the store, all in one. He carried, in his cabin or his strongbox, the wages of dozens of hard men and the cash of an entire operation. There was no sheriff around the corner. There was no telephone to call for help. The nearest real law might be a full day's hard ride away, which on frontier roads, in bad weather, might as well have been a week. A man in August Waldvogel's position was a target, and he would have known he was a target, and the knowledge of it would have lived in the back of his mind every single night. The low animal awareness of a person who holds something worth taking and has no one nearby to help him keep it. So hold that in your mind, alongside the cabin and the baby and the young wife. August Waldvogel, barely out of boyhood, holding the money for a logging crew in the deep woods, with a family asleep in the next room. And Docia, by the time the worst of it came, was carrying their second child. A small daughter in the cradle, another baby on the way, a young husband with a responsible and dangerous job, and the whole wide-open future of a frontier family stretching out ahead of them. That is the small, bright life, a cabin, a baby, a second one coming, a young man trusted with the money, and a young woman keeping the home he came back to. It lasted only a few short years, and then, on a single night, in a single moment of fear, with a single pull of a trigger, it ended. Docia Ingalls Waldvogel's life broke cleanly into a before and an after that she would carry, silently, for the rest of her days as. And her famous niece would one day take the most extraordinary care to make certain the rest of the world never saw the break at all. Picture the cabin at night, the fire banked down low to coals, a small girl asleep, a young wife, pregnant, asleep beside her, and a young man lying awake in the dark, listening the way he listened every night to the sounds of the timber outside, sorting the ordinary creaks and sighs of the forest from the one sound he was, always, secretly, afraid of. And on this particular night, August Waldvogel heard it, or believed he did. He became certain that men were coming. Remember what he was, the man who held the money for the logging crew. Remember the world he was in, with no law within reach, no help within call, only himself between his sleeping family and whatever was out there in the dark. The fear that had lived in the back of his mind every night of that job became, in this one black hour, a certainty. He believed men were coming to rob him, perhaps to do worse than rob him. He believed they were at the door, or coming to the door, and in that moment, with his wife and his small daughter asleep in the house behind him, August Waldvogel raised his gun and fired it through the door. And he killed a man. Let me slow all the way down here, because this is the hinge of the entire story. And because the surviving account does not give us everything we would want, and a responsible telling has to be honest about exactly what we do not know. The surviving accounts name the man as Milo Goodenough. What we do not know, with certainty, is exactly what he intended that night, or how the danger looked from inside August's fear. We do not know, with certainty, whether the men outside truly meant to rob him, or whether they were there for some other reason entirely, or whether the danger he believed in so completely was as real as it felt to him in the dark. The account that comes down to us, recorded by a family historian generations later, and preserved in the careful research of the Little House scholarly community, says that he believed robbers were coming, that he fired through the door, and that the shot killed one of the men outside. The later record identifies the conviction as manslaughter. That matters. It keeps the story honest. A man was dead. August was guilty in the eyes of the court. But the record does not let us turn him into either a simple murderer or a blameless defender. The safest truth is narrower and stronger. He killed Milo Goodenough, was convicted, and was sentenced to 8 years. And so, I will not pretend to. I will not put thoughts in his head that no one wrote down. I will not stage this scene with details no one preserved. What the record does tell us, plainly and without contradiction, is the outcome. A man was dead. August Waldvogel had killed him, and the law, when it finally reached him, did not treat it as the justified defense of a home and a family. It treated it as a crime. He was arrested, he was tried, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to prison for 8 years. 8 years. Sit with that number, because it tells you something the rest of the brief account cannot. A frightened man who fired on genuine robbers in genuine fear for his family's lives, in a frontier community that understood in its bones exactly what it meant to be alone and unprotected in the dark, might well have been treated with leniency. He might not have been charged at all. An 8-year sentence suggests that whatever the court concluded about that night, it concluded that a line had been crossed grave enough to justify taking the better part of a decade out of a young man's life. We cannot reconstruct the courtroom. We cannot hear the witnesses, or the verdict read aloud, or whatever was said about the man who died, but the sentence is the one hard surviving fact about how that night was judged, and 8 years is not the judgment of a community that believed a man had simply, blamelessly defended his own home. Now turn away from August, who vanishes here into a prison cell and out of the story for most of a decade, and look instead at the young woman in the cabin. Look at Docia. She was pregnant. By the timing the records suggest, her daughter Lena was barely more than a toddler, born in 1866, and her second child, a son named August Eugene, Gene, would be born in 1868, the same terrible year the shooting and conviction tore the family apart. So at the moment, her young husband fired through that door and killed a man, and was taken away in irons. Docia was a wife of only a few short years, the mother of one small child, carrying another beneath her heart. And she was about to become something the 19th century frontier had a very specific and very unforgiving name for: the wife of a convict, a woman alone with children whose husband was in prison for taking a man's life. There is no diary, there is no letter, there is nothing in the surviving record that lets us hear Docia's own voice in that moment, nothing that tells us what she felt as the law led August away, nothing that preserves the conversations she must have had with her parents and her brothers and sisters as the catastrophe settled over the whole family like snow. The record preserves what happened to her. It does not preserve what it was like to be her. And when we reach a silence that deep in a person's story, I think the only honest thing to do is not to fill it with invention. Not to pretend we can hear words that were never written down, but to stand quietly at the edge of it and simply feel how vast it is. A young woman, pregnant, 2 years married, standing in the wreckage of her entire future, in a cold cabin in the timber with a small daughter at her knee and no husband coming home for 8 years. We are not told what she felt. We are only left to imagine, in the dark, the way she must have lain awake imagining it herself. Before we follow Docia down into what came next, I want you to understand what the law itself actually was in that world, because the word prison conjures something for us that is not quite what it was for them, and the distance between the two is part of the weight of this story. There was, first of all, the sheer slowness and distance of justice on the frontier. A killing in a logging district did not bring a squad of officers screaming up to the door within minutes. It brought, eventually, words carried by riders to a county seat that might be many hours or many days away. It brought a sheriff, sometimes, and a coroner's inquiry of some rough kind. And then the long machinery of a circuit court, which in those years often meant a judge who rode from county to county on a circuit, holding court in each place only when he came around to it. Justice was not instant, and it was not local in the way we know it. It was a slow, heavy, travelling thing, and a man accused of killing another waited inside its slowness, and so did everyone connected to him. Then there was the trial itself, of which we know almost nothing in August's case, and I will not invent it for you. We do not have the testimony. We do not know who spoke for him or against him, or what was said about the man who died, or whether August claimed, as the family account suggests he believed, that he had fired in honest terror at men he took for robbers. What we have is the verdict, written in the only language a verdict ultimately speaks: guilty, and a sentence, 8 years. And then there was the prison, and here is where the modern word fails us, because a state penitentiary in the 1860s and 1870s was a grim and brutal place, a world away from anything August had known. These were institutions built on hard labour, harsh discipline, silence enforced by punishment, poor food, cold cells, and disease. A man sentenced to 8 years inside one of them was not simply removed from society for a span of time the way we might imagine it now. He was thrown into a regime designed to break and remake him, where survival itself was not guaranteed and where the years did not pass the way. 3 years passed but ground by, one identical day after another, behind stone and iron. Later accounts place August in the state prison at Waupun, Wisconsin. I will not invent the daily details of his imprisonment, but an 8-year sentence there was no small punishment. But we know what such places were, and we know that 8 years inside one of them was very nearly a lifetime, in the sense that the man who walked out, if he walked out, was rarely the man who had walked in. Now hold all of that, the slow-travelling justice, the verdict, the 8 years inside a place built to break men, and turn it toward Docia, because every bit of it landed on her too, in its own way. Understand, first, how public it all was. This is something we forget, living as we do among strangers. Docia lived in a small frontier community where everyone knew everyone, where a family's standing was the accumulated knowledge of years of being watched, where there were no anonymous crowds to disappear into. When August was arrested, the community knew. When he was tried, the community knew. When the sentence came down, 8 years for killing a man. Every single person who knew the Ingalls family knew it, and would go on knowing it, and would carry it in their understanding of who Docia was for the rest of her life. There was no moving to a new city where no one had heard. There was no starting fresh among people who did not know the story. The story was simply attached to her, now, permanently, in the only world she had. Understand, too, what it did to her practically, on the most basic level of survival. The provider was gone. Not dead, which would have been its own grief, but a clean one, a grief the community knew how to honour. Gone to prison, which was a grief tangled all through with shame. A loss the community did not quite know how to honour, and often did not try. The wages were gone. The cabin, almost certainly, could not be held by a pregnant woman with a small child and no man's labour, and the future she had built her whole young life around, the ordinary future of a wife and mother in a settled home, had simply ceased to exist, replaced overnight by a future with no shape at all. And understand, finally, the silence at the centre of it, because the silence is the truest thing the record gives us. We have no diary. We have no letters. We have not one word from Docia herself about any of this. The historical record, careful and thorough as the family scholars have been, preserves the bones of what happened to her. The marriage, the children's birth years, the killing, the sentence, the divorce, and then the remarriage. But it preserves almost nothing of what it was to live inside those events. And I think the only honest thing, the only respectful thing, is to let that silence stand. Not to write her a tearful speech she never gave, not to invent the thoughts that ran through her mind on the worst nights, but simply to acknowledge, quietly, that behind every one of those dry recorded facts was a young woman feeling something we will never be told, and that the not being told is itself part of her story, part of the way the world has always asked women, like her, to carry the heaviest things in silence, and then forgotten that they carried anything at all. What we can do is understand her situation, because the situation, unlike her private heart, is something the historical record describes with brutal clarity. And the situation was close to ruin. Think about everything a woman in Docia's position had actually lost in a single night. She had lost her husband, and not to death, which carried grief, but also a kind of clean and dignified social standing, the honourable sorrow of the widow. She had lost him to prison, which carried the grief and the shame welded together, the double weight of losing the man and of being publicly, permanently tied to his crime. She had lost the household's provider, the labour and the wages a frontier family was built around. She had lost, almost certainly, the cabin and whatever fragile security it had represented, because a woman alone, with a small child and a baby on the way, simply could not work a frontier homestead by herself. And she had lost something harder to name and just as real, her place in the ordinary social world. The simple assumption that she was a respectable married woman like any other, an assumption the shooting and the trial and the long prison sentence had shattered, publicly, in front of every single person she knew. She had one thing left, her family. That is the one thing she had not lost, and it is the thing that saved her, and it is worth pausing on, because it is the deepest truth of this whole vanished world. On the frontier, when everything else failed, family was the safety net, the only one there was. There was no government program standing between a ruined woman and disaster. There was no charity she could count on, no institution that would catch her. There was only blood, and so Docia, in the worst hour of her life, did what a frontier person did when the bottom fell out. She went home, she gathered her child and her unborn baby, and she went back to the house of her parents, to Grandpa and Grandma Ingalls in the big woods. The very same house where, a few short years before, she had danced at the sugaring off in the dress, with the buttons like blackberries. She came back to the firelit room. But she came back broken, with a toddler at her side, and a baby in her belly, and a husband in a cell, and the dress and the dance must have felt, by then, like things that had happened to a different woman, in a different life, before the gun went off in the dark. And it is here, at the very bottom of her story, that Docia does the thing that makes her, to my mind, one of the quietly remarkable women in this entire family, because most women in her position, in that time, would simply have waited out the 8 years, waited for the husband to come back from prison, because the alternative was nearly unthinkable, and stayed married to him, whatever he had become inside those walls. That was the safe road. That was the expected road. And it is here, at the bottom of her story, that the record does something quieter, but just as life-changing. The marriage ended, not in the clean way death ends a marriage, and not in the modern way we imagine someone simply choosing a new life. The exact legal mechanics matter. The divorce was tied to Wisconsin law after August's conviction, not merely to one private moment of courage. But the human result was the same. Docia was no longer August Waldvogel's wife. She was a young mother carrying Lena and Jean through the public wreckage of a killing, a conviction, and a prison sentence. To understand how astonishing Docia's divorce really was, you have to set down almost everything the modern world assumes about marriage and feel your way into the assumptions of the 1860s, which were different in a way that is genuinely hard for us to grasp. In our time, divorce is ordinary, common, woven so deeply into the fabric of normal life that it carries little shame and no real mystery. A marriage ends, the people in it move on, and the world barely pauses to notice. That is so completely the water we swim in that it takes a real act of imagination to understand that for a frontier woman in the years just after the Civil War, divorce was something else entirely. It was rare. It was hard to obtain, legally and practically, and socially, in many communities, it was close to catastrophic, a mark that could follow a woman for the rest of her life and, quietly close doors, she would never see closing. A divorced woman in that era was a kind of social anomaly, and not a respectable one in the eyes of many. She was suspected, almost automatically, of some failure or fault, because the assumption ran so deep that a good woman kept her marriage together no matter what came, that endurance was the highest feminine virtue there was, that a wife's suffering was simply her portion, to be borne in silence, to choose, deliberately, with your own will, to end a marriage. Even a marriage to a man sitting in prison for killing someone was to step outside the warm protected circle of the dutiful wife, and out into a far colder and far more exposed place, where the rules were unwritten and the judgment was constant. And Docia stepped out into it anyway. Let me be careful again, because the record is brief, and we should not pretend to know more than we do about her reasons. The account tells us only that after August went to prison, Docia divorced him. It gives us no transcript of her thinking, no record of the nights she must have spent turning it over. But we can look hard at the situation she was in, and we can understand why a clear-eyed young woman might have made that choice. And we can understand, too, what it must have cost her to make it. Consider her two roads. If she stayed married, she faced 8 long years as the wife of an absent convict, and then, at the end of them, the return of a man who had killed someone and spent the better part of a decade behind prison walls, a man she would have to take back into her home and her bed and her children's lives, with no possible way of knowing what those years had made of him. If she divorced, she faced the immediate, public difficulty of being a divorced woman, but she also faced her future as a free one, able, at least in principle, to begin again, to marry again, to choose a different man and walk a different road. The first road was the safe one, in the narrow sense that it kept her inside the protected category of the wife. The second road was the brave one, and the harder one, and the one that required her to gamble that a difficult freedom was worth more than a ruined security. Docia chose the second, and the simple fact that she chose it tells you something about her that no dress and no dance ever could. Whatever else she was not a passive woman. She was someone who, handed the very worst hand the frontier could deal, looked at it clearly, in the cold light of her own judgment, and decided to throw it in rather than spend her one life playing it out. And it is worth understanding what a divorce actually required in that time and place, mechanically, practically, because we tend to imagine it as a private decision, a matter of simply deciding to part. It was nothing so simple. A divorce in the 1860s and 1870s was a legal action brought before a court, granted only on specific grounds that the law recognized and the petitioner had to establish. It was not something a woman could simply declare. She had to go to the law, the same slow, distant, male-dominated law we have already watched grind through August's trial, and she had to ask it, formally, to dissolve her marriage, and she had to give it a reason the statutes would accept. We do not know the precise legal ground on which Docia's divorce was granted, and I will not invent one for you. A husband's conviction and long imprisonment for a felony was, in many places and times, itself a recognized ground, and so was abandonment, and so were other things. What we know is the outcome, that the marriage was legally ended, and that to reach that outcome, Docia had to do something that took real resolve. She had to stand in some form before the institutions of her world, a young woman, the wife of a convict, and ask to be released from the bond and see it through. That alone, in that era, took a kind of nerve that the gentle word divorce does not begin to capture. And she had to do it knowing what the world would make of it, because the world's judgment of a divorced woman was not evenly distributed. This is one of the hardest truths of that era to sit with. The double standard was almost total. A man who divorced, or whose marriage failed, carried far less of the weight. The world found ways to understand him, to give him another chance, to let the failure slide off. A woman who divorced carried nearly all of it. She was the one suspected of some hidden fault, some failure of duty or virtue, because the entire moral architecture of the time rested on the belief that holding the marriage together was the woman's job, her sacred responsibility, and that if a marriage ended, she had, in some way the community would never quite stop wondering about, failed at the one thing she was most fundamentally for. It did not matter that her husband was in prison for killing a man. The mark attached to her anyway, because that was how the mark worked. It found the woman. So, when I tell you that Docia chose divorce, I am telling you that she chose, with open eyes, to take that mark onto herself in exchange for her freedom. She traded the protected status of the wronged wife, the woman everyone could pity, while she waited faithfully for her husband to serve his time, for the suspect status of the divorced woman, in order to be free to build a life that was actually hers. It was not the safe trade. It was not the trade most women in her position made. And the fact that she made it tells you again and again the same thing about her. She would rather be free and judged than secure and chained. And now picture the daily life that choice handed her, because this is where the courage stops being abstract and becomes a matter of mornings and evenings and the endless grind of getting through. She was a divorced woman with a small daughter and, soon, an infant son, living back under her parents' roof. Think about what that meant, day after ordinary day. She was a grown woman who had had her own home and her own household and her own husband, now folded back into the crowded family she had grown up in, a dependent in the house where she had once been a child, in a culture that worshipped independence and self-sufficiency. That measured a person's worth in large part by their ability to stand on their own. She was, through no failure of her own will, unable to stand on her own, and she knew it, and everyone around her knew it. She would have helped, of course. She would have worked the way every woman in that house worked, cooking and cleaning and minding the younger children and her own 2 little ones. But she worked now inside her parents' household, on her parents' terms, a returned daughter rather than a wife in her own home, and the difference between those 2 things in that world was the difference between standing and leaning, and she felt it every single day. And her children grew up inside that shadow. Lena, the little girl, and the infant son still to come, would grow up as the children of a divorced mother and an absent, imprisoned father in a community that knew exactly what their father had done. Whatever Docia could shield them from, she could not shield them from the basic facts of their own beginning. And she must have known that too, must have looked at her small daughter and her unborn son, and understood that she was raising them into a story that already had a dark first chapter written before they could read it. Her second child, the son, was born into the wreckage in 1868. The records call him August Eugene, and in the family he became Gene, though when Laura wrote about him decades later, she would give him a different name on the page. He was born, in all likelihood, into the very middle of his mother's reckoning, a baby arriving in the wreckage, his father already gone or going to prison, his first years shaped by the strange, hard in-between existence of a divorced frontier woman's household. And here, I think, is the place to sit for a moment in what it actually took to be Docia in these years. because it is easy to summarize a divorce in a single sentence and move on, and it is much harder and far more honest to feel the daily weight of it. She was raising 2 small children, essentially alone. She had no husband's labour and no husband's wages. She was leaning on her parents and her brothers and sisters, which meant she was a grown woman, a mother living back in her childhood home, dependent. In a culture that prized independence and self-sufficiency above nearly everything else a person could possess, she was carrying the social weight of the divorce, and beneath it, the heavier weight of the crime, the knowledge that everyone who knew the family knew exactly what August had done, knew there was a man in the ground and a husband in a cell, knew the whole terrible story and could not unknow it. And she was carrying all of it young, with most of her life still ahead of her, in a world that offered a woman in her position very few second chances and made her fight for the ones it did. The books contain none of this. I want to keep saying that, gently, all the way through, because the contrast is the entire point of tonight. In the world of the Little House books, this woman does not exist. There is no divorce, there is no prison, there is no man dead in the dark, no 8-year sentence, no young mother carrying a baby back to her parents' house under a cloud of shame. There is only, years later, a pretty woman in a buggy and a generous job offer and a dress remembered from a dance. Everything you are hearing tonight is the very thing that was folded away, with care, so that the pretty woman in the buggy could appear on the page clean and simple and uncomplicated and kind. But she was none of those easy things. She had walked through fire. And the truly remarkable part, the part that turns her story, in the end, from a tragedy into something much closer to a quiet triumph, is what she did next. Because Docia, the divorced woman with 2 small children and a first marriage in ruins, did not vanish into a diminished, shadowed half-life at the edge of the family she rebuilt. She found her second chance, and she reached out and took it with both hands, and his name was Hiram Forbes. In the mid-1870s, Docia married again. His name was Hiram Forbes, and in the years to come, in the pages of her niece's books, he would become Uncle Hi, a good-natured, easy-going, comfortable sort of man, a railroad contractor, the husband Aunt Docia drives clear across the country to rejoin. He is, in the books, the only husband Docia is ever shown to have had. And that is the first and most important thing to understand about Hiram Forbes. In the real historical record, he is her second husband, the man she married after a divorce, the man who came into her life when she was already the mother of 2, and already carried the whole hidden weight of her first marriage's collapse. In the books, he is something far simpler and far cleaner. He is just her husband. The first marriage, the divorce, the prison, the dead man, all of it has been quietly lifted away, and Hiram Forbes has been slid gently into the empty space, as though he had always been standing there, as though there had never been anyone before him at all. We will come to exactly how that quiet substitution was performed, and why, in the final chapter. For now, I want to stay with the human reality of it, because it is genuinely moving, and because a second marriage after a catastrophe like Docia's was not a small thing. It was a door opening that, for a great many women in her position, simply stayed shut for the rest of their lives. Think again about everything she was carrying when Hiram Forbes chose to marry her. A divorce, 2 young children, a first husband sitting in prison for killing a man. By the cold social arithmetic of the time, Docia was not an easy woman to marry. She came with history, and hard history at that, the kind that made cautious men more cautious and respectable families nervous, and Hiram Forbes married her anyway. He took on the divorced woman, and her 2 children, and the whole shadowed story standing behind them, and he built a life with her. And by every sign the records give us, it was a more stable and more prosperous life than the one she had lost in the timber. And here, slowly, Docia's hidden story begins to bend back toward the famous one, because Hiram Forbes was a railroad contractor, and the railroad in the 1870s was the single greatest force remaking the entire western half of the country. The great lines and the spur lines and the branch lines were pushing out across the plains. Mile after mile, and behind the surveyors and the graders came the camps, the rough temporary towns of workers and suppliers and contractors that sprang up at the end of the track and crawled westward with it as it advanced. A railroad contractor was a man riding the very leading edge of the nation's expansion, with work wherever the rails went, which in the late 1870s meant out into Dakota Territory, into the wide, unbroken, ocean-like grassland that the railroad was about to crack open for settlement. So, picture Docia now, a decade or so past the night the gun went off. She is no longer the broken young woman who carried her babies home in disgrace. She is a married woman again, the wife of a railroad contractor, part of a family riding the great westward push of the rails into new country. Her daughter Lena is growing into a girl, and both the records and the books remember Lena vividly. A black-haired, black-eyed, fearless child, a year or so older than her cousin Laura, the kind of girl who could ride a pony back across the open prairie and was frightened of nothing under the sun. Her son Jean is growing up beside her. The household has stability again, and income, and a future. She had come back from the dead in the way the living sometimes do. Not by forgetting the catastrophe, because no one forgets a thing like that, but by carrying it and walking on anyway, by building a second life on the very foundation of the first one's ruin. And the second life was, by every measure we have, a good one. The federal census places the Forbes family in Dakota Territory, in Yankton, by the end of the 1870s and the opening of the 1880s, settled, working, woven into the raw new world the railroad was conjuring out of the grass. Let me set you down inside that railroad world for a moment, because it is the engine that carries Docia, and then her brother, into the rest of the story, and because it was one of the most extraordinary things happening anywhere in the country in those years. The 1870s and the years right after were the height of the great railroad push across the northern plains, and what it did to the land was almost beyond imagining. A territory that had been open grassland, travelled by native nations and a scattering of traders and settlers, was being crossed, line by line, by iron rails laid at a furious pace, and behind those rails came towns, conjured almost overnight out of nothing. The railroad companies did not merely build track, they built the future of an entire region, deciding where towns would rise simply by deciding where to put a depot, turning empty prairie into a main street and a grain elevator and a row of false-fronted stores within a single season. People poured in behind the rails, drawn by the promise of cheap or free land, the homestead dream that had pulled Americans west for 2 generations, now reaching its last great frontier on the Dakota Plains, and the men who built it lived in the camps. The railroad camp was a cousin of the logging camp, another rough, temporary, mostly male world at the leading edge of the work, a cluster of tents and shanties and rail cars that housed the graders and the track layers and the teamsters, and that moved forward, week by week, as the line advanced. And just as the logging camp had needed a paymaster and a storekeeper, so did the railroad camp. And that is exactly the kind of work Hiram Forbes, as a contractor, was part of providing. Someone had to feed those men and pay them, and keep the store where they bought what they needed, and keep the time and the books for an operation strung out along miles of new grade. It was steady, necessary work that rode the very crest of the nation's expansion, and it is the work that would, in time, have a job in it for a struggling brother-in-law back in Minnesota. So Docia, in these years, was not at the ragged edge of survival anymore. She was at the leading edge of the country's growth. The wife of a man with steady work, in the great enterprise of the age, part of a family moving with the rails into the brand new world of Dakota Territory. It was, in its way, a remarkable recovery and you should let yourself feel the size of it. The young woman who had carried her babies home in disgrace was now a contractor's wife on the Dakota frontier, part of the very machine that was building the future. She had not just survived, she had climbed, and growing up alongside her now were the 2 children of that first ruined marriage. And one of them, in particular, deserves a moment because she is the one piece of all this hidden history that you have, in a sense, already met. Lena, Docia's daughter, born in 1866, was about a year older than her cousin Laura, and both the family record and the books remember her as something close to a force of nature. A girl with black hair and snapping black eyes, fearless, full of life, the kind of child who could ride a pony bareback flat out across the open prairie and laugh while she did it when the 2 families' paths crossed out in Dakota. Lena and Laura would come to know each other as cousins do, and the wild, free, pony-riding cousin would lodge in Laura's memory vividly enough that, decades later, she would put her right into the books. So, if you have read them, you have met Lena. You have felt her gallop across the grass. What you were never told, what the page kept from you, was the rest of who Lena was. The daughter of a divorced mother. The daughter of a father in a prison cell for killing a man. The child of the catastrophe, grown into a fearless girl on a pony. Her whole dark beginning folded away so completely that she could appear in a children's book as nothing more than a thrilling cousin who rode like the wind. And her brother Gene beside her, born into the wreckage in 1868, grown now into a boy on that same prairie, carrying the same hidden history behind the same ordinary childhood. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that when you hold the whole picture. 2 children, galloping across the Dakota grass in the bright open air of the frontier, free and wild and alive, and behind them, invisible, the cabin, the gun, and the dead man and the prison and the divorce, the whole weight of it carried silently by their mother, so that they could simply be children, so that their cousin Laura could remember them as nothing heavier than a girl on a pony. That is what Docia had managed to do. She had taken the worst thing that ever happened to her, and she had built, on top of it, lives in which her children could run free, and a brother could find his way out of a trap, and she had done it so completely that the darkness underneath never showed. And it is here, with Docia restored, remarried, riding the leading edge of the frontier alongside her contractor husband, that her hidden life and the most famous frontier story in America finally, quietly, collide. Because in 1879 and into 1880, the railroad work carried the Forbes family west into Dakota, and Hiram Forbes needed a good, trustworthy man to help run the store and keep the books and the time for one of the railroad camps. And Docia knew, without a moment's hesitation, exactly the man for the job, her brother. The one back in Minnesota, scraping a hard and failing, living out of a worn-out claim on the banks of Plum Creek, with a house full of children, an eldest daughter who had recently gone blind, and the restless, unkillable, lifelong conviction that somewhere, just over the next horizon, lay the place where everything would finally work. Charles. Pa. And so Docia did the one thing the books do remember, the single bright scene out of her whole hidden life that they allowed onto the page. She climbed into a buggy, alone, and she drove. Out of Dakota, across the open territory, all the way to the little house on Plum Creek, to bring her struggling brother an offer that would change the entire course of the Ingalls family's life, and put them, within 2 short years, directly into the path of one of the most severe winters Dakota Territory had ever remembered. She did not know that last part. Of course, nobody did. She came carrying what looked, from every angle, like pure good fortune. A job, $50 a month, a way out of the trap of Plum Creek, and a road toward the homestead her brother had been chasing his whole adult life. She came as the answer to a struggling family's prayers. What she was actually carrying into that muddy Minnesota yard was the hinge of the entire second half of the most beloved frontier story in America, and she had no more idea of it than her brother did. This is the moment most readers actually remember, even those who have forgotten everything else about Aunt Docia. So let me set it down carefully and let you stand inside it, because it is the one place where the hidden woman steps fully into the light of the famous story, and because the gap between what the scene shows you and what you now know was standing just behind it is the sharpest, saddest gap in this entire night. Picture Plum Creek near Walnut Grove in Minnesota in 1879, drifting toward 1880. Picture the little house there and the family inside it, because that family is in trouble and has been in trouble for years. You may already know the shape of it, even if the books smooth the edges. There were the grasshopper years, the seasons when the Rocky Mountain locust came down out of the sky in clouds so vast they blotted out the sun and stripped every green and growing thing from the land in a matter of hours, devouring an entire year's crop and an entire year's hope in a single roaring afternoon. There was debt. There was the long grinding exposure of a family that had moved too many times and recovered too few of them, that kept arriving in new places with almost nothing and trying to build something out of it before the next disaster found them. And there was Mary, the eldest daughter, who had recently come through a terrible illness, long remembered in the family as scarlet fever, though modern researchers suspect it may have been something else. An illness that left her blind and tied the whole family even more tightly to the desperate need for a steady wage and a settled place. Now picture the morning. A buggy comes up the road toward that little house. And in the buggy is a woman the family has not seen in a long time, a pretty woman in a neat brown dress and a sunbonnet, and when Ma finally recognizes the face beneath the bonnet, the name she says, slowly, almost in disbelief, is Docia. In the book, it is a scene of sudden rising hope. Aunt Docia has driven all the way from Dakota Territory, alone, across the open country to bring news. Her husband, the railroad contractor, needs a good man to run the store and keep the books and the time for a railroad camp out west. The pay is $50 a month, and there is more than the pay, because out in Dakota, the land is opening at last, and a man drawing steady wages on the railroad could be looking, at the very same time, for a homestead of his own, a claim, the dream of free land that had been pulling families westward for a generation. Pa hears it, and you can feel something in him catch and kindle, the old restless hope flaring up again behind his eyes. Ma, in the book, does not want to go. She has gone west too many times already, buried too much, packed and unpacked too often. But the offer is too good, and the family's situation is too hard, and, in the end, the decision is made the way these decisions were always made in that family. They go, that is the scene. A kind aunt, a generous offer, a struggling family's fortunes turning at last. And here is the remarkable thing. Every single piece of the action in it is true. Docia really did drive west, alone, to bring her brother that offer. Hiram Forbes really did have the railroad work, and really did need a man. The Ingalls family really did pull up stakes and follow that offer into Dakota Territory, and that move really did set in motion everything that came after. And now let me show you what is standing just behind the scenes, invisible on the page, in the soft space the words leave out. The pretty woman in the buggy is a divorced woman. The kind aunt with the generous offer is the survivor of a catastrophe so severe that her own niece would one day spend real, deliberate effort erasing it from the record. The husband she is driving across a territory to rejoin is her second husband, the man who married her after her first marriage ended with a man dead in the dark, and a husband sentenced to 8 years in prison, and the children who will appear in the Dakota chapters. Lena, the wild pony riding cousin, and her brother Gene are the son and daughter of that first, ruined marriage, the children of a man in a prison cell, though the books will quietly let you assume they belong to the kindly contractor. Every single person in this scene of pure frontier hope is carrying a hidden history, and the woman at the very center of it is carrying the heaviest one of all. She does not speak of it. There is no reason on earth she would, and no sign at all that she did. She has rebuilt her entire life precisely by carrying the catastrophe in silence and walking on. And so, on the morning she pulls her buggy into the Plum Creek yard, she is not a tragic figure at all. She is a triumphant one. A remarried woman riding the leading edge of the frontier, doing a simple kindness for a brother in trouble. The darkness is behind her, folded down small and carried quietly. What she brings into that yard is the future, and what a future it turns out to be. Follow the thread forward now, gently, because this, where Aunt Docia's single bright scene blossoms out into the entire back half of the most famous frontier story in America, and the size of it is genuinely staggering once you let yourself see it. The Ingalls family takes the offer. They go to Dakota Territory. Pa goes on ahead to the railroad camp, and then the rest of the family follows after him, and Laura takes her very first train ride, and they come out into the raw new country at the end of the track. They spend a strange, silent, lonely winter, all alone in the surveyor's house on the shore of a lake, after the railroad men have gone east for the cold season and left the prairie empty. And then, in the spring, as a brand new town begins to rise out of the open grass, Pa puts up one of its very first buildings in what will soon become the town of De Smet, the place that will be the setting for nearly all the rest of the books, the place where Laura will spend her girlhood and her young womanhood, where she will become a school teacher and where she will meet a young homesteader named Almanzo Wilder and in time marry him. And one winter later, into that brand new, barely built, catastrophically exposed little prairie town comes one of the most severe winters Dakota Territory had ever remembered. The long winter, 7 months of blizzards, one rolling in on the heels of the last, from autumn nearly to spring, that buried the town, and by January, the railroad connection that town depended on had failed, leaving De Smet cut off until the trains finally came again in May. Months of cold and hunger and darkness that brought the people of De Smet to the very edge of starvation, that finally forced 2 young men, one of them that same Almanzo Wilder, to drive a sled out across the frozen, trackless prairie in a desperate, half-mad gamble to find wheat somewhere, anywhere, and bring it back and keep an entire town alive until the trains could run again. It is, for a great many readers, the single most powerful book in the whole series. The one that lodges in you and never quite leaves, the one where the gentle frontier story turns, for a while, into something close to a survival epic. Let me walk that future with you, slowly, because the chain of consequence that hangs from Docia's buggy ride is so long and so heavy that you have to take it one link at a time to feel its full weight. It came the move itself. The Ingalls family left Plum Creek and went west into Dakota Territory, and Pa went on ahead to the railroad camp, the very kind of camp we have already stood inside, to take up the job Docia's husband had opened, the storekeeper and bookkeeper and timekeeper, the keeper of the money, and the time for a crew building the line across the open grass. And then the rest of the family followed after him, and Laura rode a train for the first time in her life, out across a country, flattening and widening as it went, until the timber and the creeks of her childhood gave way to the great level ocean of the Dakota Prairie, a landscape with almost nothing to break the wind or the eye, beautiful and severe and utterly exposed. Then came the first winter, the strange one, the lonely one, when the railroad work shut down for the cold season and the camp emptied out, the men going east to wait for spring. The Ingalls family stayed behind, alone, in the surveyor's house on the shore of a lake, the only people for miles in a vast, silent, snow-covered emptiness. Picture that. A single house, a single family, in the middle of an enormous frozen plain, through the long Dakota winter, with no town, no neighbours, no one. It was a season of deep isolation, and it was also, in its way, a season of peace, because they had food and shelter and one another, and the worst had not yet come. The worst was waiting 1 year further on. Then came the spring and the town. As the snow melted and the railroad work resumed, and the settlers began to pour in behind the rails, a town began to rise out of the bare prairie almost overnight, in the way those railroad towns did, and Pa put up one of its first buildings, and the place was given a name. De Smet. This was the town that would hold the rest of the story, the place where Laura would grow from a girl into a young woman, where she would study and teach school, where she would meet a young homesteader named Almanzo Wilder, driving a fine team of horses, and where, in time, she would marry him. Everything that the later books are about happens here. In this town that exists, on this spot, because the railroad came, and the Ingalls family is here to see it founded, because Docia drove a buggy to Plum Creek and offered Pa a job. And then, 1 year after the town began, came the winter, that the records and the books both remember as something close to the edge of human endurance, the long winter. It began early, with a blizzard in October, before anyone was ready, and then it simply did not stop. Storm after storm came howling down out of the northwest across the open plain, one every few days, for months on end, from autumn nearly to spring. The snow piled up and packed down and piled up again until it buried the new little town nearly to the rooftops. And then the railroad, the very thing that had created De Smet and made it possible to live there at all, failed. The cuts filled with snow faster than the crews could clear them. The trains stopped coming, and a brand new town full of settlers who had counted on the railroad to bring in their food and their fuel found itself, in the deep of that endless winter, completely cut off from the rest of the world, with the supplies running lower and lower and no way to bring in more. Try to feel what that actually was, stripped of the gentle glow the books cast over it, months of cold so severe it could kill, a person caught out in it in minutes, blizzards so blinding and so frequent that simply crossing from a house to a barn became a deadly gamble, and people strung ropes to find their way, fuel running out, until families were twisting hay into hard sticks to burn because there was nothing else, and food running out, slowly, steadily, in a town with no way to resupply, until the spectre that haunted the whole frontier, hunger, real hunger, the kind that kills, came creeping into Smet and settled in for the duration. The people of that little town spent that winter in a slow, grinding fight against cold and darkness and starvation, and they did not know, through most of it, when or whether it would end. And it is out of that winter that one of the most famous acts of the whole saga comes, because at some point, with the town's food nearly gone, and the trains still buried and no relief in sight, two young men made a decision that could easily have killed them both. One of them was Almanzo Wilder, the young homesteader Laura would one day marry. The other was a friend named Cap Garland. Word had it that a settler somewhere out on the open prairie, miles from town, had a store of seed wheat, and so these two young men took a sled and a team out into that frozen, trackless, blizzard-haunted emptiness, in the dead of that winter, gambling their lives on finding the wheat and getting back before the next storm caught them in the open, and finished them. They found it. They bought it. They brought it back, and that wheat helped keep the town of De Smet alive, through the last of the winter, until the spring finally came, and the snow finally melted, and the trains finally ran again, and the long ordeal was over. It is, for a great many readers, the most powerful thing in the entire series, this story of a town besieged by winter and saved, in part, by the courage of two young men on a sled. And I want you to hold the whole shape of it now, the whole chain, and feel the size of what hangs from a single woman's buggy ride. Docia drove to Plum Creek and offered Pa a job. Pa took it, and the family went to Dakota. Because they went to Dakota, they were in De Smet when the town was founded. Because they were in De Smet, they were there for the long winter, and Laura lived through it and would one day write it into the book that more readers love than any other in the series. And because they were in De Smet, Laura was there to meet the young man who drove out into that killing winter for wheat, the young man she would marry, the man whose name she would carry for the rest of her long life and put on the spine of every book she ever wrote, Almanzo Wilder. And the Ingalls family is only there, in De Smet, in the killing path of that winter, because a woman in a buggy drove out of Dakota in 1879 to bring her brother a job. Pull that single thread and feel the whole weight that hangs from it. No buggy, no offer, no Dakota, no Silver Lake, no lonely winter in the surveyor's house, no De Smet, no long winter as the Ingalls family actually lived it. Perhaps no meeting with Almanzo in the way it truly happened. Perhaps a wholly different ending to the entire story, or perhaps no story at all in the form we know and love. Aunt Docia, the woman the books reduced to a dress, a dance, and a single generous scene, is in plain fact one of the load-bearing pillars of the entire saga. She is the hinge on which the whole second half of the story turns, and she did it, as far as anyone alive at the time could have told, almost by accident, by simple family kindness, by carrying a job offer to a brother who badly needed one. And there is a deep, quiet irony folded inside that, and I want to let it settle over you before we move to the final chapter, because it is, in a way, the most beautiful thing in this whole hard story. The frontier was a world held together by exactly this. By family reaching across distance to catch family, by the bonds of blood doing the work that no government and no institution would ever do. Because there was no one and nothing else to do it. Docia driving west, alone, to bring her struggling brother a job, is that entire vanished world distilled into a single act. It is the safety net working exactly the way it was meant to work. And the woman performing the act of rescue was herself a woman who had once been saved by that very same net, who had carried her own children home to her parents in the worst hour of her own life, and been caught and held when she had nowhere else on earth to fall. The rescued had become the rescuer. The woman the frontier had so nearly destroyed had become the woman who, reaching out across the open territory, pulled her brother's whole family toward the place where their most famous chapter would be written. That is who Aunt Docia really was. Not a pretty dress at a firelit dance, not a kind woman in a buggy, a survivor who became a saviour, carrying a hidden catastrophe behind a quiet smile, changing the course of a story she never knew she was changing, and asking, in the end, for nothing at all. Which leaves us, at last, with the one question this whole long night has been walking toward from the very first minute. If all of this was true, if Docia's real life was this dramatic, this dark, and this important, then why on earth did Laura leave almost every bit of it out? And what does it mean for the books and for us that she did? Here, at last, in the quiet at the end of the night, is the heart of it. Laura Ingalls Wilder knew her aunt's story. She knew it whole. She knew it the way family members always know these things, absorbed across a childhood of overheard conversations and low voices and family lore and the simple, unavoidable proximity of growing up among the very people it had happened to. She knew there had been a first husband. She knew there had been a killing and a trial and a prison sentence. She knew Docia had been divorced. She knew that Lena and Jean, the cousins she had played with and squabbled with on the deck at Prairie, were the children of that first, ruined marriage, and not the children of the kindly contractor Hiram Forbes at all. She knew every piece of it, and when she sat down, in her 60s, with her grown daughter Rose Wilder Lane working closely alongside her as editor and collaborator to turn her family's life into the books that would make her one of the most beloved authors in the history of American letters, she made a long series of deliberate choices about what to keep and what to quietly set aside. And one of those choices was Aunt Docia. What she did, specifically, is documented, and it is worth being precise about because the precision is exactly what makes it land. In the books, Docia is presented as a woman married to a widower with 2 children. That single gentle phrase does an enormous amount of quiet work. It explains the presence of the cousins, Lena and Jean, without ever revealing who they truly are. It lets you assume the children are Hiram's from an earlier marriage that ended in the clean and respectable way, through the death of a first wife, rather than telling you that they are Docia's, from an earlier marriage that ended in the shameful and complicated way, through a killing and a prison cell and a divorce. With one careful phrase, Laura took a divorced woman and her convict children and recast them, on the page, as a wife and her widower husband's stepchildren. The divorce vanished. The prison vanished. The dead man in the dark vanished. August Waldvogel vanished so completely that a reader of the books would never know, could never know, that he had existed at all. This was not an accident. It was not that Laura had forgotten, or never quite knew, or somehow overlooked it. That is the whole point. She knew it perfectly well, and she chose, with care and deliberation, to write a version of her aunt that the truth could never embarrass. Historians and scholars who have worked closely with Laura's original autobiographical manuscript, the document written around 1930 and finally published in a deeply annotated scholarly edition by the South Dakota Historical Society Press in 2014 under the title Pioneer Girl, and who have worked with Caroline Fraser's later Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Laura, Prairie Fires, have traced exactly these kinds of choices all the way through the books. The published Little House story is not a transcript of what happened. It never was. It is a carefully shaped narrative built from real events, but smoothed, simplified, compressed, and selectively edited. And the editing very nearly always runs in the same direction, toward the clean, toward the wholesome, toward a frontier that was hard but fundamentally good, peopled by families that were poor but fundamentally decent, in a story a child could be read to sleep with, without ever once brushing up against the darker textures of what frontier life had actually been. And to see clearly what Laura did with Docia, it helps to understand how the books came to exist at all, because the path from her real life to the printed page ran through a process that scholars have spent decades carefully reconstructing. It began with a manuscript she wrote around 1930, an account of her frontier childhood meant for adults, which she called Pioneer Girl. That original manuscript was, by the standards of the gentle novels that would follow, far more frank, a plainer and grittier, telling of the hard things her family had lived through. And the publishers of the day turned it down. It did not sell, but out of that rejected adult memoir, reworked and reshaped and softened and aimed now at children, came the series of novels that would make her famous, the Little House books as we know them. And so, the books were never raw memory set straight onto the page. They were memory passed through a long process of revision, selection, and softening, a deliberate transformation of a hard adult account into a gentle children's story. And she did not do that transformation alone. Her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, was a successful and accomplished professional writer in her own right, a journalist and author with a national reputation, and she worked closely with her mother on the manuscripts, editing, shaping, advising, revising. Exactly how large Rose's hand was in the final books is a question scholars genuinely debate, and have debated for years, and I will not pretend to settle it for you, because it cannot be settled with certainty. Some see Rose as a heavy editorial collaborator who shaped the books profoundly. Others see her role as more modest. What is not in dispute is that the books were the product of more than one mind and more than one pass. A worked and reworked thing, crafted with real care toward a particular effect, the warm, clean, gentle frontier story that has held readers for generations. The decision to fold Docia's divorce and August's crime away was made somewhere inside that long crafting process by an author and perhaps an editor who knew exactly what they were leaving out and exactly why. We know all of this in such detail in large part because of the work of later scholars, and two efforts in particular are worth naming because they are the ground beneath tonight's whole story. The first is the annotated edition of that original memoir, Pioneer Girl, published in 2014 by the South Dakota Historical Society Press, which set Laura's raw account side by side with exhaustive historical research, and let readers see, for the first time, the gaps and the differences between what the records showed and what the novels said. The second is Caroline Fraser's biography of Laura, Prairie Fires, which won the Pulitzer Prize and which traced the real history of the family in unflinching detail. It is through work like this, patient, documented, careful, that the real Docia and the real shape of what Laura did with her has been recovered. None of it comes from rumours. All of it comes from records, and from the scholars who went looking in them. And once you know what to look for, you begin to see that Docia was not the only place the book smoothed the hard edges down. She was part of a pattern, a consistent gentle pressure running all through the series in the same direction. Think of the family's time in Kansas, the years that became one of the most famous books, The Little House on the Prairie itself. The land the family settled on there was, by the best historical understanding, land they had no legal right to occupy, on a reservation, and in the end they were ordered off it and had to leave. The book turns that into an adventure, a brave family on the open prairie, and leaves the harder legal and moral complications quietly to one side. Or think of the year the family spent in Burr Oak, Iowa, in the late 1870s, running a hotel, struggling, a grim and difficult stretch that scholars believe was simply too hard and too far from the pioneer ideal to fit the story, and so it was left out of the books almost entirely. An entire chapter of the family's real life, quietly dropped from the published one. I point to these not to tear the books down, because I love them too, and so do you, or you would not be here listening tonight. I point to them so that you can see Docia in her true context. The erasure of her divorce and August crime was not some strange, singular act of concealment. It was one expression of the deepest principle the books were built on. The principle of telling a true story by leaving out the parts that were too dark, too complicated, or too shameful to fit. The books are honest about so much: the poverty, the failures, the hunger, the fear, the moving and moving and moving. But they are honest in a particular key, a gentle one, a key that had no room for a man shooting another man through a door, or a young woman standing before a court to dissolve her own marriage. And so those things, like the Kansas land and the Burr Oak year, were folded quietly away, and the gentle story went on. And here is where I want to be fair to Laura, genuinely fair, because it would be easy to tell tonight's story as a tale of dishonesty, and I do not believe that is what it was. Consider what she was actually making. She was writing books for children. Books meant to be read aloud, in a soft voice, to small children, by their mothers, at bedtime, in the 1930s and the years after, in the middle of the Great Depression, to a frightened and exhausted country that badly needed stories about endurance and family and the possibility of coming through terrible hardship with your dignity and your love still intact. A killing, a prison sentence, a divorce. These were not things you put into a children's book in that era. Not because they were untrue, but because they had no place at all in the kind of book she was making. The genre itself, the gentle frontier story for young readers, simply could not hold them. To include August Waldvogel's crime would have been to write an entirely different book, a book for adults, a book about the real darkness woven through frontier life, and that was never the book Laura set out to write, nor the book her readers wanted from her. And there is the simple human matter of family. Docia was Laura's aunt. Lena and Jean were her cousins, real people, flesh and blood, many of them alive and reading when the books came out, to lay August Waldvogel's crime and Docia's divorce out in cold print for millions of strangers would have been to expose her own living relatives to public shame for the sake of a fuller story. It is not hard at all to understand why a woman would choose not to do that, why she would protect her aunt and her cousins by quietly folding the hard history away, why she would hand the world the pretty woman in the buggy and keep the broken young mother in the cabin private, inside the family, where she felt she belonged. So, I do not think the erasure was a lie, exactly in the sense of something done to deceive for gain. I think it was something more complicated and more human and in its way more tender than that. It was a kindness and a simplification and an act of an author's craft and a protection of the living all at once, all braided together. Laura was not trying to fool history. She was trying to write a good and gentle book and to shield her family, and those two aims pointed in the very same direction, toward leaving August Waldvogel out. And yet something is lost when we let the gentle version stand as the whole of the truth. And I think it is worth naming, very precisely, what that something is, because it is the entire reason a night like this one is worth spending at all. What is lost is Docia herself. The real one, because the pretty aunt in the buggy, the kind woman with the generous offer, is a far smaller and far less remarkable person than the woman who actually drew breath and lived. The book version of Docia is simply a nice relative who does a nice thing and disappears. The real version is a woman who survived a catastrophe that would have crushed most people flat, who made a hard and brave and socially ruinous choice when she divorced a husband almost no one would have blamed her for keeping, who raised 2 small children through the wreckage of a first marriage, who rebuilt her entire life from its ashes, and who then restored and remarried, and riding the very leading edge of the frontier, reached all the way back across a territory to rescue her struggling brother, and in doing so changed the course of the most famous frontier story in America, and never knew she had, and never asked for a word of thanks. That woman is so much larger than a dress at a dance. And when we let the book stand as the only record of her, that larger woman quietly disappears, and a flatter, prettier, smaller one steps into the empty space where she used to be. The very act of kindness that protected Docia also, in the same motion, diminished her. It saved her from shame, and in saving her from shame it hid her courage. It is a strange thing, and a quietly sad one, that the same gentle hand that kept the dark part of a story private also kept the strong part of it, the genuinely admirable part, the part worth honouring, from ever being seen by the millions who came to love her family. And there is one last thing, and then I will let her rest. The whole deep emotional power of the little house books, the thing that has made generation after generation of readers love them so completely, comes from one particular feeling, the feeling of a small family, mostly alone, holding together against a vast and indifferent frontier by nothing in the world but their own love and their own grit. Pa and Ma and the girls, the wagon and the fiddle, the one little house standing brave and lamplit and utterly alone beneath an enormous, empty, star-scattered sky. That image is the very soul of the books, and it is beautiful, and it is also, quietly, not quite the whole truth. Because the Ingalls family was never truly as alone as the books make you feel. They were embedded in a wide web of family, of brothers and sisters, who had married into one another's neighbours, of aunts and uncles, and cousins, closer than cousins, of obligations that ran out in every direction across the territory, like the threads of something woven on purpose. And the single clearest proof of that web, the single clearest example of family, reaching across distance to hold the family together, is the very scene the books did choose to keep. Aunt Docia, in her buggy, bringing her brother a job, the books show you that scene, and let you feel it as a happy accident, a lucky break, a kind aunt doing a kind thing on a bright morning, but it was never an accident. It was the frontier's deepest logic, made visible, made flesh. It was family being the only safety net there was, because there was no other. And the woman performing it had once been caught by that same net herself, in the very worst hour of her own life. So once you understand Docia's whole story, all of it, the cabin and the gun and the dead man and the prison and the divorce and the long, patient rebuilding, her buggy ride out of Dakota stops being a pretty coincidence and becomes something far deeper than the books ever let it be. It becomes the whole truth about how these families actually survived at all, carried by a single woman in a single buggy across an open territory all the way to a muddy yard on Plum Creek, into the very heart of a story that would never once tell her secret. So that is Aunt Docia, the pretty one, the one with the buttons like blackberries, the one who danced in the firelight while a small girl watched and remembered, and also the one whose first husband fired a gun through a door in the dark and killed a man and went to prison for 8 years, the one who did the thing frontier women almost never did and divorced him, and gathered her children, and carried them home, and then built a second life out of the ruins of the first one. The one who drove west, alone, to save her brother, and changed the course of the most famous frontier story in America, and asked for nothing, and was repaid by being folded down into a dress, and a dance, and a single generous scene, so that the story she made possible could stay gentle enough to read a child to sleep. Laura kept the darker family story off the page, and for generations most readers never knew what stood behind Aunt Docia's buggy ride. And tonight, gently, for just a little while, we unfolded it again, and we looked at the whole woman, the real one, in all her hidden courage, before we fold her carefully back up and let her return to the quiet where she has rested all this time. So, see, rest easy now. The fire is low, the night is long, the covers are warm, and there is nothing left for you to do tonight but drift. And somewhere far back inside the story, no longer quite hidden, a pretty woman in a brown dress is still driving her buggy west across the open grass, alone, on her way to do a kindness she will never once be thanked for, carrying the whole rest of the tale behind her like a secret she has decided, for the sake of the people she loves, to keep. Let her drive, and let yourself now, finally, fall asleep.